who are actually talking to this audience. We're mainly members of faith groups, and what we really want to determine is what is the common good, not our own necessarily vested interests. What is good for British people? What is good for poor British people? What is good for Europeans? What is good for Europeans who are seeking work, who may be unemployed? What is good for refugees who are fleeing to Europe? Is there a way of determining the common good which will, and what will serve that common good best, being in or being out?
What will serve common good best, Tom?
Well, see, I absolutely, I love Europe. Europe is very different from the European Union, from the political structure of the European Union. But actually, one of the things I personally love most about Europe is its patchwork of equality. It's that cultural diversity that comes through its national democracies. And I think that the model of a nation state has its flaws, and I realise that we're moving towards a much more interconnected global world. However, I do believe in the enduring relevance of a nation state, and I think that whatever the flaws of our own national democracy, it's the best thing we've got. So I think democracy is in the interest of people across Europe. I'm a believer in having power as close to people as possible. That's why I'm a localist. I find it hard to be a localist and not be concerned about the extent to which the centralising tendency within the European Union. I believe in concentric circles of identity. One of the quotes actually which means a lot to me is a quote by Edmund Burke, which is to love the little platoon, to love the subdivision, to pursue the public affections by which you come to love the community, you come to love the country, and you come to love the rest of humankind. I think democracy is in the interest of all people in Europe, and I think the new model is in the common good for Europe. I think the political structures of the European Union, centralising power, moving it away from people, I don't think that's good for Europe, I don't think it's good for the common good.
Rupert?
Well, I think the common good is exactly the right way to look at this problem, and I think whether that's from a faith perspective or not, I think people who are trying to come at this not from a kind of narrow nationalistic way of viewing the world, but from a sort of more open-hearted and generous way of looking at the world, I think that is exactly the right way to go forward. Now, it's great to have localism, but unfortunately there is also this thing called international politics. As we all know, that can go very, very horribly wrong, and sometimes does. So the question is, do we, by getting out of Europe, out of the EU, make things easier or better or more difficult in terms of resolving disputes, international disputes, in a reasonable and in a non-confrontational way? And I think the EU, certainly for its 28 constituent parts, has provided a framework in which we can negotiate. Yes, people negotiate hard, but at least they're negotiating on relatively friendly terms, and we all realise that we're all in it together. And I think actually that ethos does then extend a little bit, at least, outside of the EU. And the EU clearly does support democracy, it clearly supports human rights, and we've heard stories about what will happen when Turkey joins the EU. And the reason Turkey is nowhere near joining the EU at the moment is because of its record on things like democracy and human rights. And it could never get to the point of even being considered to be part of the EU until it had really very, very fundamentally reformed that society and that political system to be much more in line with the sort of democratic way of doing things. So I think in terms of the common good, yes, in terms of economic good for sure, but in terms of the common good more holistically considered, then I'm absolutely sure that remaining in the EU is the right answer.
Thank you very much. I'm going to actually move the discussion on to Rachel Larkinson. Yes, Rachel, would you like to go? This is quite specific. Oh, okay, all right. Okay, well, in that case, Rachel, going to have to let Vicky in. Nick, go.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. And of course, when you have any problem, you look from different facets and you see different things. I think poor people in this country are currently being failed, actually. And I think the pressure on our young people to find jobs. I'm not hearing you back. Can you not hear me? Where's the sound engineer? Can you hear me now?
Speak closely into it, Nick.
Doing testing, are we? I'll hold it nearer to you. So the young people in this country are suffering, they're struggling to find jobs, and when they do find them, quite often they're not full-time jobs, and the wage levels are low. And that also applies to the elderly and to some people who are coming to the middle of their careers who want to step down. It's not as easy as it could be. So I think there's a problem, and that is a problem because we're getting highly skilled migrants from the EU coming here unrestricted. So I think for the UK, it is better for us to leave for the common good. I think for Europe, it is better for us to stay in the EU because we provide a beacon of hope and light, along with France and Germany to a certain extent, for people who want to aspire to much greater things. But I think the problem is, what we're then forgetting, is you're forgetting the rest of the world, the other 173 countries out there, who also need our help and support. I talked to somebody who used to have a company in the UK and in Sri Lanka, and it was a double-down job to get my Sri Lankan colleagues to come to the UK for training because quotas were being hit because people were coming from the EU. And I think that is fundamentally unfair. And I think we also have a problem that with the refugees, if we're able to manage our migration so that the indigenous population are not being spooked, frightened or concerned by large numbers, and Cambridge is fine, but you go to Wisbeach and Peterborough where I spent a lot of time, people are getting very fearful. It's an unrealistic fear, I have to say, but fearful the same. But if you can control migration, then of course you can be much more sympathetic to help refugees who are genuine refugees. The real problem at the moment is defining what a refugee is versus an economic migrant, and there's a whole rough process around that.
So on the refugee situation, I spent a lot of time listening to what people in other countries have been saying about this as well as ourselves, and it has put a huge pressure on those countries neighbouring the crisis situation, especially the 11 million displaced people from Syria. I don't believe we make those situations any better by walking away from tables where people are trying to work out what to do. Okay? I do think that when Mrs. Merkel said, come everybody in, it had an unintended consequence on increasing people trafficking, and that the reaction now to say, how do we try and stabilise the region and put more help and hope into the refugee camps, because if you had been living in a refugee camp for 2 years and you hadn't had a job, you thought your kids weren't going to be educated and a rumour's gone around the camp there'll be no food or water come winter, no wonder people started to leave those camps. So the UK is now the largest donor after America, and we've now been working with other European countries to put much more support into those areas. We talk a lot about the money we pay into Europe. We never talk about the fact that a large amount of that money is going into international aid and development, and that part of the reasons that the UK influences Europe is saying we need to help more in our neighbouring regions and other parts of the world too. I do think, as I said, that if the UK leaves, we could have a sort of unravelling of the whole sweater, like pulling a loose thread, and create much more political instability across Europe, and I don't believe that is in anybody's interest, especially the most vulnerable. Just a quick plug for Papworth Trust. They've done an extremely interesting brochure of Q&A for vulnerable people, which I shared this week, and I thought it was really worth looking at that. Not saying which way people should vote, but things like looking at disability rights. I've just been working on a package about making sure that disabled people can have the same access to information in the online world as they get in the offline world, and trying to make sure that we have equality for people with different disabilities and vulnerabilities as well in a modern world. So I don't believe that one can underestimate the risks of this recession, and we do know that in a recession it is the most vulnerable who are often hit the hardest. And that is why I think for all its faults, and yes we need to modernise it and make it more accountable and democratic, but we cannot afford to take the risk to leave.
Thank you very much.